Okay, hi everyone. This is Kathleen, and unfortunately, Zoom was not my friend today, so I'm having to record this on my phone. I'm just hoping it'll go through. All right, well, either way, okay. So the language that I chose to talk about is the Japanese language. Okay, so first and foremost, the Japanese language is spoken by 127 million people all across the islands of Japan. Along with that, there are at least 1.5 million Japanese immigrants that have mainly migrated to North and South America. So something interesting about the Japanese language is that it is the only major language whose genetic affiliation is currently unknown. And by that I mean that most languages, like English, you can basically pinpoint where certain things might have come from, parts of our language, to other languages. And that's just not the case for the Japanese language. However, there is a theory that it has connections to the Korean language, but as of right now, that's still just a hypothesis. All right, so the Japanese language has several different dialects that are, of course, based on where that person is from. So some dialects could include Kyushu, Haicho, and then there's a couple of Eastern and Western dialects as well. And these dialects are said to be so different that people from the West can't even understand Japanese citizens that are from the North. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and talk about the phonology differences between Japanese and English. So the first difference that I'm going to say is that, as you can see here, the Japanese language contains only 5 vowels. With these 5 vowels, though, there are, of course, long vowels and short vowels, which, as we all know, with every language, could make a complete difference in meaning when you're trying to speak. Next, we have the English vowels. So English vowels, there are 15, which is a huge difference, but that's also because it's including the diphthongs. And then here I just made a little note that I saw that Japanese learners tend to substitute their English vowels for vowels that they're already familiar with, such as the 5 that they have right there. So that's just going to be something to note maybe when you're working with patients who are bilingual. Another difference is that the tension between used in the vowels are different between both languages. Okay, and then right there, I found a really nice chart that demonstrates the difference between the vowels in both languages. So on the left right there, that's clearly the English side, since it has way more compared to the 5 over there on the Japanese side. And if you'll also note, some of the placements for the vowels are just slightly different. Like the I's in the corner there, you can see that the English one is closer, a little higher compared to the one on the Japanese side, which is going more towards the middle section. And that's just, of course, with the placement for the vowels, but I thought it was interesting. Okay. Next, here we have the consonants, of course. So on the left side, the Japanese side, I tried listing out the consonants. Hopefully that's all right. And then I also just noted that, of course, the accent markings and stress could be different for the consonants depending on what's being said. I even have a little note right there of the consonant inventory. And then on the other side, I have the English consonants. So in comparison, there are 24 consonant phonemes in English, and on the Japanese side, there's about 14 to 16 consonants. So pretty huge difference, I would say. Another thing to consider with your students is that there is no R or L sound in the Japanese language. So you'll most likely need to teach that sound to your students or patient in therapy because it's just going to be new. I did note in one of the articles that there's sort of another sound in between the R and the L that sometimes bilingual learners will use. Okay, and then I also have here that in English, voiceless stop consonants are aspirated, but in Japanese, they're unaspirated. And lastly, labiodental F and V and interdental THs are not contained in the Japanese fricatives. So now moving on to semantics. Japanese is typically divided into either the root or affix, as you could see there, and then I put little examples that I found. Okay, and then moving on, we have this interesting part of the Japanese language called loanwords. And so loanwords are words that are taken from another language, as the name implies. Excuse me. Okay. As the name implies. So this could either be like they have a couple that are Chinese, but a lot of them are English, and of course just plenty of different other languages that these loanwords are from. And they also have pseudo-English words, which are words that were created based on an English word, but they're not actually, words that are used. It was just based on a word. Okay, and I just wanted to add that another name for these loan words that you might hear it's called gaireigo, and this whole loan word business started around the 19th century by the younger generation. And then here on the side, I actually listed some really interesting loan words, or I found this list at least. So here you have English word knife. They have naifu, and then fork, foku, and then there's a couple more there, which I just thought they were very interestingly cute words, I would say. Okay, so now moving on to syntax. So now for syntax, the Japanese language uses a subject-object-verb pattern as opposed to in English where we use subject-verb-object instead. So it's SOV versus SVO. In English, it would be Billy hit the ball, whereas Japanese, it would be Billy the ball hit. So that would be another thing you'd have to look out for in your students. If maybe they start using that pattern, it's just something to consider. So next, I'll go ahead and talk about pronouns. So in English, the pronouns we use are pretty set in stone, and I feel like the only time we really change our pronouns is maybe somebody tells us, or the situation is just different a little bit. It's nothing too drastic, such as in the Japanese language, where pronoun usage depends on who is speaking, so who's the speaker, and what the situation is between the two of them. So me as a woman speaking about myself to another woman who's maybe a family member is going to sound a lot different compared to if I were talking about myself to maybe a man that I'm unfamiliar with. Lastly, in this section, I will talk about the plural form in Japanese. So in English, we usually add an S, or we maybe change the word completely when we're making it into a plural. However, that's not the case in Japanese. In Japanese, they really don't change much. So right there, I put a little example. Hito could be person, it could be people. It's going to, again, depend on the context of things. So that'll be another consideration to take into account, is teaching maybe to add S's to words, because maybe your patient isn't doing that when they're speaking English, because that's just what they're used to. And next we have pronunciation. So I just thought this was interesting, is that the pronunciation for Japanese words, it's usually, like several other languages, to where you could just look at the word and sound it out, and you're pretty much right on the dot. Whereas in English, of course, that's really not going to be the case for a lot of words. Especially if you look at words like cough and though and throw. Somebody logical would probably think it's just pronounced, that O part is just the same. But of course, everything changes. So that's just another consideration, especially when you're talking about literacy and things like that, that I thought would be nice to point out. Okay, so here we have the IPA chart that I found online. And as you can see, we have the consonants on one side, the vowels on the other side. And I just thought this would be interesting to include for any of you who were interested. Okay. Next on this side, we have the age of acquisition. So for the Japanese side, one article I found included several age of acquisitions that they had found and put it all on one chart. So this is just something that you can refer to, but just looking at it, you can see that there's just slight differences that you're going to find compared to Japanese and English. So like the B sound on that side, we have one saying it's a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and then here on the English side, we have B at 3 to 4 years old for age of acquisition. So again, just another consideration. Excuse me one second. Okay, so as I was saying, the age of acquisition for certain sounds could be different based on the Japanese language versus English language, which is just, of course, something you need to make note of when you're working with these patients. Okay, so next we have here pragmatics, and I would say that the huge difference here is that the Japanese language uses honorifics language, which is called keigo. And it's basically, it has to do with the levels of formality, as you can see towards the bottom there. So who you talk to will determine the formality that you use. And while I know in English we do use certain like sir, ma'am, Mrs., things like that, in the Japanese language it's more serious is a good word. It's a very notable difference. And it's even more so the difference here that I put on the side right there is that they add small things like sama, san, kan, chan to the end of names depending on who you're talking to. So you would use chan at the end of your friend's name to signify that you're close, basically. Or you would use kun if you're talking to just men in general, superiors, things of that nature. Okay, and then next, another pragmatic difference is here that the Japanese is considered to be a high context culture. So in that way, they're looking a lot at nonverbal communication and implicit. They're really indirect with what they're saying, as maybe a way to be polite is a good way to put it. And another difference is that the culture as a whole prioritizes collectivism, meaning that they aren't thinking so much about themselves as individuals too much. They want to make themselves better, mostly so that the collectivism as a whole will benefit, such as maybe in the workplace or the classroom. On the other hand, here in the United States, we're considered a low context culture. So we're direct with what we say, and we value individualism. So we work for ourselves, and that's it, which is completely different from the Japanese. Okay, so next I wrote down some cultural considerations based on what I've read and what we've learned so far in the class. So for assessment, I would consider using a dynamic assessment to really get the best picture of the individual that you're assessing. I would use a lot of language samples. Involving the family would be very important, considering that we know that they are collectivists. Interviews with them would be especially beneficial. And of course, for collecting case history. And of course, if I'm ever assessing a bilingual individual and I have the option to get an interpreter, I would. And my last consideration for assessment would be just to remember to consider both languages at all time. For treatment, I put for cultural considerations that your student might be using formal language, student or patient, because in this case, you're considered to be in an honorable position, a respectable position, I should say, since you're basically their doctor. And I would say involve the family would probably be pretty important. And just take note of loan words, I would say. Just because, like some of them ones that I said, like the forku for fork. If it was just an English-speaking child, we would automatically write that down as like an issue. Whereas knowing that this culture uses loan words, now we know like, oh, that's just the word that they use for it. So those are just some considerations. Okay, so the disorder that I chose to focus on is speech sound disorder. The study I chose was trying to describe the assessment of residual speech sound disorders and describe how there might be other domains of assessment that should be looked at if we want to truly understand speech sound disorder in bilingual individuals. This case study looked at an 11-year-old who presented with a residual speech sound disorder. The child's family spoke mostly using Japanese, with his mother occasionally using English. However, the child's formal education, which she received at 6 years old, has been primarily in English. So residual speech disorders are speech disorders that typically persist past the age of 9, when the child should not be making any more misarticulations. So this study mentions how it's often difficult to determine that a bilingual child has it because they're still learning the language, so it's difficult to say whether they're actually having difficulty or if they're just still in the learning process. So to test this child, they gave him parallel speech assessments in English and Japanese, along with a speech motor and phonological awareness task in both languages. For the most part, they saw several errors in English, which they wrote up due to the influence of Japanese. They saw that he was transferring Japanese characteristics of language to English. Another thing, though, that they saw was that the child still showed residual speech sound disorders in both languages. What was important to note here, though, was that even though there were some residual speech sound disorder misarticulations, several of this child's speech pattern simply reflected that he was, as I said earlier, transferring patterns, and that was what was leading to a lot of misarticulations as well. So ultimately, what the study wanted people to see is that there doesn't need to just be one reason as to why this child is having these issues. The child doesn't need to be just, oh, he's just learning the language, or oh, he just has a speech sound disorder. In this case, it was both reasons was why he was struggling, which is just something that they were trying to make researchers take note of, because a lot of times people blame it on one or the other. So the SLP might just say it's the disorder, but a teacher might just say, oh, well, he's learning in the language, he doesn't need speech services. So that's what was really interesting with this study. Okay. And then for my special population, I chose to focus on autism. So this study here wanted to see if bilingualism would affect the executive functions along with social and communication competence in children with autism spectrum disorder. So a large reason that this study was done was to stop professionals from suggesting that using only one language would help their child with autism. So to complete this study, they gathered a total of 67 kids and separated them into bilingual and monolingual groups. And of course, they spoke Japanese, with some of the bilinguals speaking English. So both groups were tested on executive functioning through a series of tasks and then given questionnaires for their competence. It was shown that there was no significant differences in the group except for on the Stroop task, but the effect was not significantly different. So in the conclusion, it was basically that, of course, there was no difference between the groups. So that's them trying to tell professionals to stop suggesting that stopping their child from learning another language is going to help their language, as they could see that it really didn't make a difference between the monolinguals and the bilinguals. All right. And here we have my references. And that is all. So thank you all for sticking with me. And I'm so sorry about all these difficulties. All right. Bye.